Hello, welcome to Biblio Files, the show on AADL TV, where we take a few moments to each pick a different book on one specific book theme. And this week we are discussing linked short stories. My name is Amanda, and I'm joined by Christopher and Lucy, as always, and I'm excited to see what short stories we are going to discuss today. Lucy, can you share what you brought for us today?
Sure. The collection that I picked is called Karma and Other Stories, and it's by Rishi Reddy. I learned about her because of a novel that I read through the NRA's book club called Passage West. And this story collection was written before that. It was written in, I think, 2007. And these stories are linked in that it's sort of like this short story cycle. All the stories, except for one, take place in and around Boston, Massachusetts, mostly in Lexington. And it's a small Indian community. So you might read about someone in one story, and then you'll be reading about someone else who's that person's son, and you realize that it was mentioned. So it's all the same characters, and they all know each other, and they all do things together, rely on each other. So it's really interesting how they are connected. It's the chronology of the story. It's not in chronological order, but I think it sort of goes from, I feel like it goes from the person who has, well, I guess, so all these stories, I think, have a theme of being displaced, like the difficulty of having one foot in two worlds, because these people are either, they came from India themselves, or they're descendants of people who have. So they're sort of straddling those two different worlds. And I feel like the progression of the stories starts with like this older man who's a judge, or he was a judge in India, now he's not. And he has trouble adapting to the different mannerisms and ways, things that people do things, like, for instance, in restaurants, how they don't treat you the same way and all these things. So he really is struggling with the right way to get along in this world, like not suing everyone who kind of makes him mad. And then you end up like with a kid whose parents have moved from Boston to the Midwest. And so for him, he was totally living this life in Boston that he wasn't straddling two worlds. That was his life. But now he, again, is a total outsider because he's one of very few Indian kids in the West. And then in between, you have people who are, like in the first story, the judge's son might briefly be mentioned, and then he comes up again in another story, or his wife. There are a lot of stories that touch on the difference between arranged marriage and marriage for love, and sometimes how those two things can intersect. The title story was probably my favorite, and it's about these two brothers, one of whom is very successful, and he invites his younger brother to come over from India to live with him in Lexington. He finally kicks him out because that younger brother's not doing anything. And part of the story is the younger brother wandering through the financial district of Boston. That's another thing I loved about this collection of stories is, I've like walked the places where I could picture these characters exactly where they were going. So that was fun. But then he finds all these birds that have flown into buildings, and it's sort of this way he had hurt a bird when he was younger, and so it's this cycle of karma, but karma comes up in other ways. And it was just really fun to read because I kept looking for where the characters were connected. I would hear a name and I'd think, oh, wait, I heard that one. When I was finished, I had to like write down everything and be like, oh, that's the son, and that's the so the way that they were linked was not like a novel, it didn't read like a novel in stories, but they were linked through this set of characters who are also very closely linked in their own lives, because the fact that they have this culture outside of India in Lexington, Massachusetts is very integral to who they are. So that was Karma and Other Stories by Rishi Reddy. Christopher, what did you pick?
Well, I read this book, Men Giving Money, Women Yelling by Alice Madison. And I'd never heard of Alice Madison before or this title, so I'm so glad I had a chance to read this. This book is 25 years old now. And so we often read things that are more recent than that, but this was a very fast read. It's a lot of fun. It's 15 short interconnected stories. But if you read the stories carefully, you'll realize that each of the stories really is independent. So the stories don't take anything for granted. They don't really assume that you've read the rest of the book, even though the characters are all linked from one story to the next. They show up in many, many different places. And it turns out that Alice Madison had published many of these stories separately. So, but the whole collection works really well. It's interesting to read this book because the characters there's a definite tone to this book. The characters really live in a kind of detached way, I would say. There's not a lot of introspection. They kind of drift into relationships, and both the men and the women. I would say that men are not depicted very well in this book. They're kind of schlubby. They're cheating on their wives. They're really not very attractive. And so all of the characters are kind of drifting through life more or less, making these sometimes haphazard decisions. And you really don't get a sense that they're changing or growing too awfully much. It's still wonderful to read, though. It's really a lot of fun. At the center of many of these stories is Ida and her turquoise bag that show up in so many of them. And there's also Denny, who's out of jail, and he's the cause of a lot of mischief in many of the stories. There's one fascinating piece, I thought, where some of the characters go to a play, and it turns out that this play is also one of the other short stories that there's a very particular scene that happens, which is then recreated in this play. So that was really an odd and interesting choice, I thought. The whole thing reminded me very much of the 1993 movie Shortcuts. I don't know if anyone has seen that. That seems to have been kind of buried by time now, but it was very reminiscent of that. And that's it for Men Giving Money, Women Yelling by Alice Madison. Quick, fun read. Amanda, what did you read?
Well, that sounds really fun. And so I picked a brand new book. I didn't really know what to read. I read more short story collections the past year, I feel like, than I've done in a while. But I wanted a new one, so I went to the catalog and I found one, and it's not new as far as publication. The book I read is called Veda by Patricia Engel, and it was published in 2010. And it's interesting because all three of us picked books, like mine is the newest book we're talking about today, and it was published in 2010. So I think that's interesting. But the story is Veda, and it's more of instead of having similar characters that are peppered throughout the different stories, this one follows one main character, Sabina. So Lucy, you mentioned a novel and short stories. That's sort of what this is, because it tells the story, and it's sort of a coming of age of this young woman, Sabina. She is a daughter of Colombian immigrants, and it's told out of order. It's not chronological, but it's just different snapshots of different points in her life. And a lot of it is her narrating. And the book is exquisitely written. It was a debut novel when it came out in 2010. And I did not look to see what the author's done since then. I'm sure she's published other novels since then. But Sabina, she's smart, she's witty, she's depressed, she's imperfect. And it's sort of her, with her family. So her family has a home in a suburb in New Jersey. And then she also spends time in Columbia, in Miami, in Manhattan. And she doesn't always make the right choices. A lot of it is, there's 9 stories in it, and it's different points in her life where maybe she's a teenager dealing with like her, an ill aunt, or her with a different boyfriend that she's with. The book is called Veda, and Veda is the title of one of the short stories. And Vita's a character in that one that she meets who ends up coming from her brothel. And then Sabina sort of ends up helping her and she was an illegal living in Miami, bringing her home, and then her family helping her get back. I forget where, maybe she was from Puerto Rico. I forget where her home country was, but it's just, and I don't think this book would have sounded attractive to me like individually, but I think it would have been, I don't want to say boring as a novel, but I really liked that it was just these shorter glimpses of scenarios and times in Sabina's life. I think it would have been a harder story to write. And I think that it allowed the author a lot more leeway with language to tell the stories individually. And I really enjoyed getting to know like some of these guys she dated, some of her friends. Her family was really interesting. Some of the different maids that lived in their house and her relationship to them. Part of it is like her with her being Latina and her identity and language and who she's friends with, who she hangs out with, and that sort of thing. So I really enjoyed that. And it's just so beautifully written. There were so many beautiful sentences in it. I just like would read a couple sentences and pause and like, okay, that was gorgeous, and then continue. And I don't want to say the book is morose or that it's depressing, but it definitely has sort of a lower tone to it, where it's not just like, it's not just stories of a female sharing stories about guys she's dated or complaining about her immigrant parents. It's just told in a way where you're sort of like, and it's funny because the book, she's like hanging out, or there's a female hanging out at the side of a car window. And that's sort of like how I felt in the book, where she was just driving to the next stop and there was a story. So I kind of felt like a passenger on her journey. So it was just, I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad I came across it. It was just kind of one of those random things I found searching the library's catalog. So I was happy to find it. So that is the story Veda by Patricia Engel. Does anybody have any other final thoughts on short stories, connected or not, perhaps?
Well, doesn't it make you want to try writing your own? At least
story or connected?
Either one. I mean, because my short stories in this book were fascinating, and they were so short that it did just make me want to sit around and think of my own characters and see how I could connect them. Anyway, that's what occurred to me.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think that's neat about linked short stories is like, Lucy, you mentioned this with your book, trying to figure out like the background characters that come in later. You're like, oh yeah, that was the guy in the coffee shop. And then you get his story. For me, that's one attractive thing about linked short stories, is trying to find those connections, even if they're just background. So for me, this was definitely like reading a novel, and short stories was a little bit different from like my perspective of like short stories that have nothing to do with each other in a collection, or ones that have like that are interconnected through character or setting. So this was a different way. This is a really cool way, I think, to meet a character and get it sort of a novelization version of it. So really fun topic today. I'm not sure who suggested this one, but this was a lot of fun, you guys.
Yeah, it was fun to look for something. So.
Yeah. All right, we will wrap it up there with our linked short stories discussion. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have a suggestion for some short stories or ones that are linked, we would love to hear them. If you click the link below, it'll take you to the library's website, and we would love to hear from you if you've got any at all book suggestions or comments of things we've talked about on the show here. But that's it for this time, and we'll see you next time.